Hello class, we're going to discuss the Russian Revolution today, and for the sake of time, we're going to jump right in. So the year's 1917. Russia, at this time, was, how would you say in historical terms, a complete wreck. World War I was going poorly, the Japanese War in 1905 had gone even worse. Workers were suffering, and to top it all off, Russians still had to deal with a total autocrat, Tsar Nicholas II. So to put it in simple terms, there were two Russian revolutions that we can truly distinguish. The first was in March of 1917, and the second was in November of the same year, and lasted all the way until 1922. So the first revolution, which was the much more peaceful one, first took off with bread riots in the city of Petrograd on March 8, 1917. Groups of workers, or Soviets, who were tired of having to fight and pay for a massive war that Russia wasn't even winning, went on strike and convinced others to do the same all across Russia. Pretty soon, even the Russian Cossacks, who as you will remember were the experienced fighters that were very loyal to the Tsar, they even joined in on the protest. This eventually culminated in the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the installation of a provisional government headed by Alexander Kerensky. In simple terms, we can say this government had two parts: the Duma, which was what was left of Russia's last parliament and included mostly upper middle class people, and the Petrograd Soviet that represented the urban class. Now, even though this definitely isn't what you would think would happen from a communist revolution, it actually seemed to work, except it did not take Russia out of the war. After having their behinds kicked in Germany, the war became extremely unpopular in Russia, and people lost faith in this new government. This, combined with the lack of land reform, left Russians extremely disappointed, and transitions nicely into the next revolution we're going to talk about, the one in November. You call it the October Revolution, but Russia uses a different calendar. Even though a percentage of Russia's population was actually happy with this new government, it didn't actually work out that way. This is the part where we get Vladimir Lenin returning to Russia and starting to preach communist ideals to the people, trying to empower them to overthrow their capitalist oppressors and form a new nation based on communism. The Bolsheviks, a radical faction of socialist worker councils, eventually forced out the government again on November 25, 1917. A few months later, in 1918, Lenin officially pulled Russia out of World War I and everybody lived happily ever after. Just kidding, it was actually nowhere near that. Even though Russia finally ended the massive loss related to the war, the real struggle was just beginning. The first noticeable change was the closure of wartime factories that Russia had come to rely upon for its manufacturing. When most of them failed and closed, seeing as there was no more war to fight, factory workers in urban areas lost jobs in the thousands, which wasn't really a good rep for Lenin as he had promised, because he had promised jobs that would come before. Farmers also got the raw end of the deal, mainly in the form of collectivized agriculture. Instead of leaving people to serve as wage workers on private land, Lenin envisioned a world of public land ownership where all people could finally learn to share. Just like how when we were all 5 years old and didn't want to share our toys, this didn't go well with landowners that had to give it all up. Most of the lands ended up being socialized by force when the Red Army stepped in to quell the tension in the form of executions and imprisonment, but more on that in a little while. Anyway, these new social farms had to meet with some massive quotas or standards in grain productions, to which people couldn't keep up on these giant but rather hapless new farms. This set off a long chain reaction. Grain production did rise, but the government set the price very low to make sure everybody could afford it. Because there wasn't any profit to be made, the farmers would then withhold the grain, which didn't do anything except lead to famine among the urban workers. In 1921, a particularly nasty drought killed off most of the crop and over 6 million people died. City population declined as much as 50% in some areas, and the Red Army had to step in again, usually forcibly confiscating grain from the farmers without mercy. So the new Russia had definitely gotten off to a rough start, obviously enough, which understandably made Lenin rather unpopular across the nation. Even though Lenin ran on the premise of supporting the people, new laws were quickly enacted that banned all criticism of the Communist Party and severely limited the ability for other non-Marxist groups to have their voices heard. So if you're into hearing about good old totalitarian communism like back in the glory days, 1918 is a pretty good time to start. After an attempted assassination on Lenin failed in August 1918, that's when we can say things really started getting out of hand. The head of the Cheka, or secret police, ordered a crackdown that later became known as the Red Terror. Thousands of Russians were executed in the few months that followed, and even though we think of them as silencing the opposition, much of the victims weren't even enemies of communism. They were just simply not communist as they were supposed to be, so to speak. Members of milder social groups, particularly the Mensheviks, were captured, imprisoned, or executed without trial. We see many of these other groups rise up along with the Bolsheviks throughout history, but they definitely weren't as radical as the Bolsheviks were, making them susceptible to political attacks. We saw this a lot in the French Revolution too, when people that supported a constitutional monarchy got caught up in the reign of terror by radical reformists who wanted to completely change France their way. Also, like the French Revolution, Russia turned into a bloodbath. Starting in June 1918, a new political force called the White Movement looked to force out the remaining communists that had hijacked Russia. The Whites weren't a solid ideological bloc, but more like a coalition of people that supported the Tsar, the Duma, or anybody that wasn't communist. They and the Red Army, which was the term for the Bolshevik military, went to war and it raged on until 1922 when the Reds finally ousted or captured any remaining White Army soldiers. Even though the Whites had the West on their side and they received some considerable support, they simply couldn't win over the people who were both scared of the Reds and distrustful of anybody who wanted to bring the Tsar back. All opposition eventually crumbled and the new Soviet Union formed. So all that was certainly a lot to follow, but it's nothing without saying why all this happened. Did it all start with a simple bread riot in Petrograd? Those had been going on for a long time before the revolution actually started. We can't even say that it was because of World War I either, because Russia had already been going on for 4 years. Instead, we look to the economic side of things. Russia had some very glaring financial problems, and these problems, as you can predict, mainly fell on the peasants and laborers who had to pay extreme taxes to the Tsar. All this spending to stay in the war also meant that Russia fell into an enormous debt before the revolution. In fact, debt was a huge part of all of the revolution. It may seem cliche, but we even have an open letter to share on the matter. An open letter to debt. Dear Debt, you really know how to get around. I mean, we like to ignore you, but you really are a big deal here. I mean, Russia was $5.6 billion in debt by the time it pulled out of the war, and the external debt soon to be grow to 20% of the USSR's GDP. You're all over the place. The old Russia were in debt, and people overthrew the provisional government and Alexander Kerensky when they refused to get rid of you and redistribute land. You see, that's what I admire about you, Debt. Just like totalitarian government, even when we get rid of you, you always come back around in some way. Best wishes, Ryan Alaminsky. So we just told you a little while ago about how the Russian Revolution ended, but how it was afterwards still needs some explanation. To start off with, it's pretty safe to say that the overall feeling of the Russian Revolution was disappointment at best. Workers that tried to rise up and force out a suppressive totalitarian regime ended up with a new one in its place, and millions of people died to famine and what seemed like endless war. As for the centerpiece of all this totalitarian communist nostalgia, aka Joseph Stalin, he didn't even come around until 1924. Even though we like to associate him with the USSR, most of the policies of the USSR were already there by the time he arrived. So in very conclusive terms, it's easy to lump communism and the rise of the Soviets into really general commentary of failed socioeconomics, but instead the truth is way more complex than that. While we like to think that what ended up of the Russian Revolution in Stalin's Russia was a byproduct of some terrible people, which isn't entirely wrong. I mean, Stalin was a pretty bad dude, along with, Lenin and Tsar Nicholas and, just a lot of other people. We have to put ourselves in the shoes of a giant part of the revolution, which was the people that started it. Remember that before the Civil War, Russia had been ruled by a dictator for over 500 years. So when the opportunity for a new way of life arose, the people jumped at it. In hindsight, we can see that perhaps the revolution wasn't such a great idea, but that is because we are looking back on it 100 years later, not living in the moment like the Russians were. Much like how China's revolution overthrew thousands of years of Chinese history, the dominant political system in Russia had finally come to an end, leaving some people completely clueless as to where to turn. So yes, there were some mean and nasty people involved in the war. I'm looking at you, Stalin. And yes, this idea seems really melodramatic, but people really did think the idea of a communist nation was reasonable. Unlike other events in history that we can say had some definite causes and conclusions, the Russian Revolution is definitely one that we have to consider with some complexity, to define an entire century after it happened.